Morning, everyone, and thank you for coming in, although there's not much of an ask given that it's raining. And welcome to our event on U.S. imperialism in Latin America. So this week's been an important one for the struggle against U.S. imperialism, as the PSUV party in Venezuela won a major victory in their elections. However, not all were enthused about the news. I believe the Irish Times reported that the so-called Chavista regime retook control, and the country is in the hands of the increasingly authoritarian Maduro. Well, this all kind of seems like deja vu to me. Didn't this just happen in Bolivia? Well, joining us tonight is Ben Norton. Um, Ben, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here. Thanks for the invitation.
Okay. Well, Ben is a journalist and assistant at the Gray Zone. It's Gray with an A, as I've learned. And one of the most important independent publishers of our time. Well, I think so anyway. Norton has previously written for Salon. That's where I originally know him anyway. The Intercept, Real News, and Alternet. He's contributed to Democracy Now!, back when it was good. And as an investigative journalist living in Nicaragua, Norton has a unique vantage point on analyzing the development of U.S. imperialism in the region. Ben, would you like to take it from there?
Absolutely, yeah. Thanks for the invitation. And yeah, as we often point out, it's Gray with an A with the Yankee spelling, because we are Americans, we're U.S. citizens, but of course we're dedicated to challenging U.S. imperialism. And I appreciate the invitation, and I just send my greetings to all the comrades in the Workers' Party. It's exciting to see that movement grow across the pond. So I believe the topic is pretty broad. I wasn't really given a kind of overview of what exactly you wanted, so I think I'll just speak kind of generally about U.S. imperialism in Latin America. I'll start kind of with a history of U.S. imperialism and go to the modern day. I won't spend too much time on the history because, of course, I think people are more interested in the struggle right now, because that's something that we can affect, that we can be involved in. And I'll keep it kind of short because I want to take people's questions and keep it more of a conversation, because, it's funny in this kind of dystopian pandemic era, it just feels kind of weird just like speaking for an hour on my computer and not participating with other people and having a discussion. So I'll spend probably like 20-30 minutes talking about the topic and is that pretty good? I don't know exactly what you had in mind.
I think that's exactly what we had in mind. So that's so you've read our minds anyway. Good stuff.
Okay, excellent. Great. Well, thanks for the invitation again. I'll just go ahead and start. And the topic we're discussing today is U.S. imperialism in Latin America. And I'll just start with something very subtle, but I think important. The event is about U.S. imperialism and not the term American imperialism. And this is an interesting topic for us. In the United States, we call ourselves Americans, and there very much is this kind of Eurocentric, American exceptionalist mentality that sees the so-called West as a political construct, because there's no reason that Western Europe and the United States should actually be a coherent political bloc. If you just look at pure geopolitics, that doesn't even make sense geopolitically. The reason it's a coherent political bloc over the construction of 300 years of 300 years of U.S. imperialism, this project was integrating the United States into this larger Western bloc of capital. And of course, the United States was founded by European colonialists who came to the modern day Americas in order to colonize the land, steal the resources, and exterminate the indigenous population. At least those they didn't enslave. They also enslaved the indigenous population. So we need to understand that when we're talking about U.S. imperialism, I'm glad we're saying U.S. imperialism, because the idea of the Americas, even as a political project, is rooted within the European colonization of the so-called Americas. This was an entire region, the United States going further south, that was victimized by settler colonialism. And that was different from other forms of European colonialism. I'm not in any way saying that that European colonialism was somehow better in some way. I mean, obviously I don't need to tell you all that there are millions and millions of bodies on the hands of these European colonialists, especially in Africa and the British colonization of South Asia, etc. But when you look at the process of colonization in the Americas, it was distinct. It was a project of settler colonialism, displacing the indigenous population. That's not what the British did in India. The British, I mean, they brutalized India. They turned one of the richest countries in the world into one of the poorest countries in the world, and deindustrialized and de-developed India over 200 years, and stole, as the Putniks, these Marxist economists in India, estimate nearly $50 trillion of wealth from India. But it wasn't settler colonization. It was a different form of colonization. In the Americas, the so-called Americas, there was this project that predates the creation of the United States in 1776, going back to the colonization of all of the land known as the Americas. So I think we can't understand U.S. imperialism in the Americas without understanding that process of settler colonization. And in many ways, that process continues, right? Because the reality is that what is the difference between the indigenous people of South America, the indigenous people of what's known as North America? I mean, there were many indigenous peoples across the region. And in terms of thousands of years of history, there was a lot of interchange between indigenous peoples in the Americas. And there were the three great indigenous civilizations, the Maya, the Inca, and the Aztecs. And there was interchange going on. And the idea of the Americas, the North and the South, being these very distinct geopolitical units is a modern construct that is a result of that process of colonization. And the reason people in the South largely speak Spanish, in South America, that is because of Spanish colonization. And the reason people in the United States and Canada mostly speak English is because of British and to a lesser extent French colonization. So, of course, understanding that history, we could talk about that for the entire time, but just, in a very brief nutshell, I think we have to just keep that in the back of our mind, because when we fast forward to understanding the process of colonization and imperialism today, I think we have to understand it very much as a continuation of that project of colonization. And I should say that this colonization was not done, liberals who acknowledge that the United States and Canada are settler colonial constructs, they might acknowledge that, but they often provide a liberal explanation for that. The European conquistadores, the Spanish and the French and the English and also just the settlers who came, who weren't representing a government, they were just settlers. They colonized the region because they wanted to spread Christianity. There's this idealist understanding, not idealist in the kind of colloquial sense, but idealist in the philosophical sense, as opposed to a materialist understanding. The idea that the Americas were colonized simply because of an ideology, because of a religion, ignoring the very real material aspect. And the reality is, I mean, if there's a famous quote from Marx in Capital, and I'm paraphrasing here, but this was in 1867 that he published this, and he said that the rosy dawn of capital accumulation was the hunting of black skins in Africa and the entombment of indigenous people in mines in South America. And when he says the entombment in mines of the indigenous population, of course, he's acknowledging that the process of capital accumulation that led the United States, Canada, and Western Europe to be the richest parts of the world, that was a process of stealing that wealth from the global South, and in the case of South America, mining that wealth. So gold, silver, spices, other minerals, and of course, still today, Venezuela is being targeted because of its very plentiful mineral reserves. So we have to have an actual materialist understanding of why that colonization happened. The religious element, the white supremacist element, those were the ideological creations that were used to justify that process of material exploitation, of theft, of simply robbing land and natural resources to enrich capitalists. So we have to understand, and this is also the creation of white supremacy as a political construct, with European colonization, especially of the Americas. And we see in Latin America, in particular, in the Spanish colonized area, the Spanish had a different form of colonization, which wasn't the same kind of settler colonization, which involves, I mean, a lot of inbreeding, a lot of rape, a lot of, forcible, I mean, just creation of this kind of mestizo elite population, again, and I should stress, often through rape. And they use the mestizo population as like the overlords to maintain control over the Spanish colonies, not only politically but also culturally, and spread the Spanish language. And we see the beginning. You can actually go back to the 1700s, and you can see that there were these Spanish paintings you can find where they have a kind of racial hierarchy, and they show all the mestizos and the mulattoes, and they say, so if you're mixed European and indigenous, if you're mixed indigenous and black, if you're mixed European and black, there is a whole, and the percentage of your ancestors, if you are 1/4 indigenous, there is a whole racial hierarchy. So we have the creation of whiteness as a political construct, which is used to, it's not that whiteness was used to justify colonization. It's the exact opposite. Or sorry, it's not that colonization was justified by whiteness. It's the exact opposite. It's that whiteness was used it was created as a political tool by these European colonialists to steal the wealth of Latin America. And they created the concept of white supremacy to justify that colonial conquest, just as it's a very similar process in the United States. It's a little different, but with African slaves and the process of the creation of white supremacy. And there are brilliant books about this. One I would recommend called The Invention of the White Race. There's another good book about how the Irish became white by Noel Ignatieff, about how in the late 1800s and the early 1900s in the United States, the Irish, Jewish immigrants and Poles, Catholics and Jews were not considered white. And they were eventually welcomed into whiteness as a political construct in order to divide the working class and keep Black and Latino and Chinese workers separate from these racialized white, like Italian immigrants, Irish immigrants. So this is all part of a similar process. And I just stress this point because today it's kind of become in vogue among liberals, among progressives, to acknowledge that the United States is a settler colony, but they blame it entirely on white supremacy with an idealist understanding as opposed to a materialist understanding, removing an actual historical materialist analysis of the reasons for colonization. It was not because they believed something, it was because they wanted to steal the wealth of North and South America. And that is still exactly the same reason today. Racism is used to justify that, but racism is not the fundamental reason. The fundamental reason is stealing the natural resources in the land and the labor through enslavement and exploitation of the people, the indigenous peoples of the Americas. So that brings us up to the role of the United States. I talked about settler colonization and all of that in the background. And that brings us to 1823. I think when we're talking about U.S. imperialism in Latin America, this is the most fundamental date. There are two really fundamental dates in the 19th century. In 1823, you have James Monroe as a president. And we should keep in mind, talking about this process of settler colonization, this is when the United States, as a political project, is continuing to expand westward. And in 1823, after a series of revolutionary nationalist bourgeois revolution movements across South America, led by leaders like Simón Bolívar, the great revolutionary, here in Central America, Francisco Morazán, there were a series of revolutionary leaders who had liberal bourgeois revolutions against the European colonial regimes and created republican states. And many of the modern countries we know in South America, including most famously Bolivia, they were created through these revolutionary processes. Bolivia was named after Simón Bolívar. Colombia as a state was created, Venezuela as a state. So we have the process of national formation happening through bourgeois revolutions, similar to the process of state construction in Europe, Western Europe, where you have the French Revolution, and then you have Italian unification, and you have German unification. So there's a similar process of state construction. And in 1823, the US government declares Latin America, South America, as its own colonial backyard. It's still language we hear today. In fact, nearly 200 years later, the Monroe Doctrine, this is the doctrine I'm referring to, is still invoked by the US government. In the Trump administration, we have seen at least two different officials, including former National Security Advisor John Bolton and current Secretary of State, the far-right evangelical Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. Both of them have invoked the Monroe Doctrine to refer specifically to the so-called troika of tyranny. Those are the countries that the Trump administration designated as the troika of tyranny. They're the only three remaining socialist governments in Latin America: Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua. And the Trump administration has openly invoked this 200-year-old Monroe Doctrine to say that we will not tolerate the existence of these socialist governments because of the Monroe Doctrine, because Latin America is our colonial backyard. Now, the justification provided for the Monroe Doctrine is interesting, and it's important when we move into this era of the new Cold War we're living in 2020, because we're increasingly seeing that the United States, the reasons it uses for its imperial intervention and interference abroad often change. After the 9/11 attacks, we had the war on terror rhetoric, the fight against this dubious concept of terrorism. Of course, that was always ridiculous, but we're now going back into this era of the new Cold War after the first Cold War and the destruction, the overthrow of the socialist countries in the Eastern Bloc. And increasingly, when you listen to US government rhetoric from the Pentagon and the State Department, they use this boogeyman of China and Russia and Chinese and Russian so-called interference in Latin America, by which the United States means bilateral consensual relations between the sovereign states of South America and China and Russia, having favorable trade agreements in the case of Bolivia, in the case of China's role in helping Bolivia try to develop its lithium reserves, and Russia's role in helping to provide military resources and weapons to Venezuela and other countries. The US frequently invokes the Monroe Doctrine and says that Russia and China are interfering in our sphere of influence. And that goes directly back to 1823 to James Monroe, because James Monroe declared the Monroe Doctrine at a time when Western European colonialists were really just kicking their colonization into hyperdrive. Of course, in the 1880s, we had the Berlin Conference, in which the European powers they take out a map and carve up Africa. So there's this period of colonization of every inch of the world. And in the United States, the government decides that they're going to put their foot down and not tolerate European colonial competition. So the Monroe Doctrine was telling the Spanish and the Portuguese specifically, this is our colonial domain, this is our sphere of influence, and we're not going to allow you to operate in our colonial backyard. That's the rhetoric, and that's still the understanding for the past 200 years. That has been the colonial understanding of the United States. I should mention that the Secretary of State who wrote the Monroe Doctrine was John Quincy Adams, the son of John Adams, one of the most famous US presidents. And John Quincy Adams, along with James Monroe, these were people who were they were expansionists. And this is a time when Florida became a state. So in the United States, frequently, there's not this much understanding of US colonization of the Americas as part of the same project of the construction of the United States as a political entity. Because if you look at the map of the United States, it's this contiguous country. It makes sense. It's from the West Coast to the East Coast, from Canada to Mexico. But that was, of course, a process of hundreds of years of colonization. And in the 1800s, there are not 50 states. And also, when we think about the contiguous United States, that's a political construct that ignores Alaska and Hawaii. So while the US declares the Monroe Doctrine, we have to understand this is still while the United States as a contiguous project is continuing to expand and steal indigenous territory. I think we have to combine those two things together, because the reality is that the United States wasn't able to colonize South America in the same way it colonized its own landmass. And that's today its imperial interventions in the region through economics, through trade, through sanctions, through military intervention is very much a continuation of that process, because it has faced the reality that it wasn't able to colonize even further south. I should mention that another important date after 1823 is 1848, in which the United States has a war of aggression led by the United States against Mexico. And the United States steals nearly half of Mexican territory, including the modern states of California, Arizona, New Mexico. California is the largest state in the United States. This is massive theft of of Mexico. So again, we have to understand this process of colonization because it's so inextricably tied to this process of imperialism in the stage of late capitalism. And then that brings us to another extremely important date. I mentioned that there are you could say three fundamental dates: 1823, Monroe Doctrine; 1848, colonization of Mexico, theft of half of Mexico in the Mexican-American War; and then finally 1898, 1899. And this is the Spanish-American War. And this is where U.S. imperialism, U.S. colonialism essentially tells Spanish colonialism, we're not going to tolerate your presence anymore in the Western Hemisphere. This is our colonial backyard. And the U.S. helps this war against Spain in Cuba and in the Philippines. It's a little more complex in the Philippines. It's clearly not part of the Americas. And Spain loses those wars. And then the United States colonizes these countries, Cuba specifically. And what's very interesting is if you look at the Cuban flag is actually a product of that U.S. colonization. And I mean, even though we're on the world today, it's a different symbol. Today, the symbol of the Cuban flag is a symbol of anti-imperialism and progressive politics and socialism. But the fact that it's a red, white, and blue flag, I mean, that was a product of U.S. colonization. And the Cubans, they stuck with the flag because it was a symbol of national unity. Similarly, in Puerto Rico, the flag is very similar. And once again, it's red, white, and blue after the red, white, and blue of the United States. So in 1898, that is the moment in which the Spanish are effectively kicked out of the Americas. And throughout this time, in the mid to late 1800s, and then especially in the early 20th century, we see literally hundreds of U.S. military interventions across Latin America. And I don't have time to get into all of that. And I know I'm speaking a little long here, so I'll fast forward here. So people can read, there are many good history books detailing the hundreds of military interventions led by the U.S. to overthrow independent states, to install rump regimes, puppet regimes, to help exploit the natural resources of Latin America. And this brings us to the early 20th century. And there's a kind of second wave of these revolutionary anti-imperialist movements. I mentioned that in South America, there had been Simón Bolívar, Francisco Morazán, these anti-colonial movements. And then there was a series of national liberation movements that really kicked off in the early 20th century. You have the Mexican Revolution, extremely important, not as explicitly an anti-imperialist revolution, but the fact that, again, that Mexico was half of its territory was stolen by the United States, and it's always had this kind of colonial relationship that was definitely on the minds of Zapata and these other revolutionary leaders. And of course, the Zapatistas themselves, they draw that name from the Mexican revolutionary leader in this time period between 1910 and 1920. And then you also have a similar movement here in Nicaragua, where you have the rise of an anti-colonial movement against the U.S. military occupation of Nicaragua in the 1920s and 1930s. You have a so-called civil war. And what we see again and again, as with Middle East now, we have these wars that are called civil wars, but what they really are imperial proxy wars, in which the United States supports one side as its kind of proxy forces against indigenous resistance forces, as we see now in Yemen, as we see in Syria. So in Nicaragua, there's a kind of a so-called civil war between the conservatives and the liberals. And among the liberal army, there's the rise of a general named Augusto Sandino. And Sandino, after the war, after they successfully win, after the end of the so-called civil war, he continues the war. He refuses to put his weapons down and continues to fight to free his land of the U.S. military forces that are occupying Nicaragua, that were occupying Nicaragua for decades. And he actually does manage to successfully push out the U.S. colonial forces. So there's this period in which we should understand where you have European colonization and you have, especially in the early 20th century, the rise of these national liberation movements. And similarly, there was this process of U.S. colonization of Central and South America. And we see the rise of these national liberation forces. And those are important historically because those namesakes become the revolutionary leaders, the heroes and models that later socialist, Marxist, and other more syncretic leftist movements in the 50s, 60s, and 70s based their struggles off after. So Sandino is killed. He's betrayed by this general who is named, he's the general who actually later controlled Nicaragua, Somoza. It was actually the father of Anastasio Somoza, and that begins the Somoza dynasty. This kind of so there's this phase of kind of neo-colonialism where the United States, its military forces get physically pushed out of the region through national liberation struggles, and they begin this project of trying to forcibly control the region through proxies, through puppet dictatorships like the Somoza dynasty here in Nicaragua. And I should mention that there's an incredible historical irony in this movement of national liberation struggles. In 2009, during the Barack Obama administration, the U.S. backed a military coup against the democratically elected left-wing government in Honduras, to the north of Nicaragua, an extremely poor country, one of the most violent countries in the world. And in Honduras, the president, his name was Jose Manuel Zelaya. Zelaya was not a socialist. He was a progressive. He was a nationalist, and he wanted what was best for his country. And he had good relations with Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, and became part of the ALBA, the Bolivarian Trade Alliance, the economic alliance. And we interviewed him last year, my colleagues and I, at the Gray Zone on the 10th anniversary of the coup in June in Honduras. And he said explicitly in the interview that John Negroponte, he was an undersecretary of state for the George W. Bush Jr. administration, that he threatened him and said, you cannot have relations with Hugo Chavez. If you have relations with Venezuela, if you join the ALBA, you're going to have problems. He joined the ALBA, and then in June 2009, he was immediately overthrown in a military coup. Now, that has an immediate historical echo, kind of tying together the phase of modern U.S. imperialism with the moment of like U.S. neocolonialism in the early 20th century, or just frankly colonialism in the early 20th century, in which exactly 100 years before, in 1909, the United States backed another coup to overthrow the progressive nationalist government here in Nicaragua, who was trying to unify Central America, including Honduras, whose name is actually, ironically, Jose Zelaya. In the 1909, it was Jose Santos Zelaya, and in Honduras in 2009, it was Jose Manuel Zelaya. So incredible historical echo. Now, we need to also understand that one of the reasons the U.S. invaded to overthrow Jose Santos Zelaya is not only because he was a progressive nationalist who wanted to kick out the U.S. colonial forces and unify Central America in a political bloc, but also because he wanted to build a canal going through Nicaragua. And that has been a commonality tying together U.S. colonial conquest of Central America back then and the coup attempt here in Nicaragua in 2018. So fast forwarding now, I'll summarize this part, modern history, because I think you all probably know it better. So this brings us to the Cold War, the first Cold War, and you have the triumph of the Bolshevik Revolution, the rise of revolutionary socialist movements taking power, not only successfully expelling colonial forces, but actually taking state power in numerous countries throughout Eastern Europe, spreading in 1949 in China. And then finally, that brings us to the creation of the Organization of American States. In 1948, at the beginning of the Cold War, right after World War II, the United States convenes an alliance of right-wing anti-communist governments from South America. They convene in Central America. They convene in Bogota, Colombia, which has been the beachhead of U.S. imperialism in Latin America since then. And in fact, Hugo Chavez kind of infamously referred to Colombia as the Israel of Latin America. So in 1948, 100 years after the Mexican-American War, the United States creates the Organization of American States, which Fidel Castro, the Cuban revolutionary leader, would famously later refer to as the Yankee Ministry of the Colonies. And of course, these days, the OAS justifies what it does with the canar, with the fig leaf of so-called democracy. But the reality is that when the OAS was created, there were a series of military dictatorships, right-wing anti-communist dictatorships that were founding members, just as with NATO, which was formed around the same time, we should keep in mind, where the U.S. is constructing its imperial blocks, these institutions to unify the West as a political construct, Western imperialism against communism. And we see NATO as a political construct created, and then the OAS created. Both of these institutions have since rebranded as forces of so-called democracy, when the reality is that both of them, including founding fascist dictatorships as founding state member states. In the case of NATO, the Portuguese military dictatorship, a fascist dictatorship, was a founding member. So similarly with the OAS. And the OAS becomes this instrument of U.S. imperialism to kind of this neo-colonialism to control Latin America. And then that brings us to the first great socialist revolution in Latin America, in Cuba, in 1959. And there's a revolutionary leader here in Nicaragua from the Sandinista front. He's the I believe they say the vice foreign minister for international affairs, or the vice undersecretary for international affairs. His name is Carlos Fonseca Terán. He's the son of the martyred founder of the Sandinista front, Carlos Fonseca Amador, who was murdered by the Somoza dictatorship. And Carlos Fonseca Terán, his son, the current leader, when he talks about their vision for the revolutionary process against U.S. imperialism in Latin America, he speaks of three different eras. Now we're in the modern time. 1959, the Cuban Revolution fundamentally shifts. January 1st, 1959. It fundamentally shifts the character of Latin American politics and global politics. And we should keep in mind that when the Cuban Revolution triumphed, it was not an explicitly socialist revolution, or it wasn't an explicitly Marxist. It was socialistic and it was nationalist, but it was not Marxist. It wasn't until 1960, 1961, when the United States first tried to, they imposed sanctions, and then a blockade, and then, of course, the infamous Bay of Pigs invasion in 61, and tried to overthrow the Cuban government, that Cuba became a close ally of the Soviet Union, and it was in both of their interests. And then Fidel Castro becomes a Marxist, and they found the Communist Party of Cuba. But I mentioned that because we should understand that it was a progressive, nationalist, anti-imperialist national liberation struggle against a U.S. neo-colonial regime of Fulgencio Batista, and then it became Marxist later. So Carlos Fonseca Terán, he splits modern Latin America in these three periods of 20-year increments. So from 1959 until 1979. 1979 is the triumph on July 19th of the Sandinista revolution here in Nicaragua. So between that period, this is his analysis, and I think it's a good, useful analysis to understand the series of struggles in Latin America. You have the peak of armed struggle, of revolutionary armed struggle by socialist guerrilla movements in Latin America. Of course, Che Guevara is the most famous example of that. He's killed in Bolivia by Bolivian intelligence and military forces backed by the CIA. And there's a series of national liberation armed movements. And Carlos Fonseca argues that these dates are never completely neat, right? Like it's never like a neat, like it just ends on this date. But in terms of understanding the kind of phases, by 1979, with the triumph of the Sandinista revolution, you have the continuation of armed struggle, but you have the period in which the military dictatorships in the region this is the kind of peak of it, right? Where you have something called Plan Condor. So throughout this region, you had military dictatorships, but in 1973, you have the infamous CIA coup in Chile, overthrowing the democratically elected Marxist government of Salvador Allende. And you have the rise of the far-right dictatorship of Augusto Pinochet. And then you have a similar process with two coups in Argentina. And you have the rise of military dictatorships across the Southern Cone, so in Paraguay and Uruguay. And you have the creation of Operation Condor, Plan Condor, as it's also known. And the United States is using these far-right fascistic military dictatorships, many of whom welcomed former Nazis and fascists who fled to Latin America after World War II. These dictatorships welcomed them. And in the case of the Chilean dictatorship, Nazis actually played an important role. Also in the Bolivian military dictatorship of Hugo Banzer, There were Nazis that played an important role in the regime, and they actually even created the Bolivian Socialist Phalange, which has the current fascist groups have their origins in that today. So you have the period of these military dictatorships, which between 79 and then 98, 99, there's a period of overthrowing the military dictatorships and returning to bourgeois democracy. Well, for the first time, creating bourgeois democracies in Latin America. And the United States, with the end of the Cold War, the United States is forced to shift its strategy and support these bourgeois so-called democracies in Latin America. Although, of course, this also leads us to the 1980s. So the triumph of Nicaragua's revolution in 79 leads to the brutal, extremely murderous U.S. proxy wars in Central America here in the 1980s, in which the Ronald Reagan administration, although it didn't begin with Reagan, it began with the Democrat Jimmy Carter, there is a Contra war in which the United States arms and funds and supports these far-right death squads, many of whom were actually elements of the former military dictatorship, the National Guard of Somoza. They formed new kind of death squad units, and they were backed by the U.S. military and trained by the CIA, and they carried out a terror war. And there's also a similar terror war in El Salvador in the 1980s. I'm sure many of you know about the Central American war, proxy wars in the 1980s. And then that brings us to this series of struggles, the creation of bourgeois democratic governments, which have neoliberal governments, neoliberal administrations that go back and forth. And there's often a kind of two-party dictatorship in many of these countries. And then finally, that brings us to the third phase of the revolutionary movements in Latin America, as articulated by Carlos Fonseca Terán. And that would be the Bolivarian Revolution, the great revolution of Hugo Chavez. And I think that is also, it's very important to understand that, like the Cuban Revolution, and to an extent like the Sandinista revolution here in Nicaragua, the Bolivarian Revolution in Venezuela did not begin as a socialist revolution, in fact. So what happens is, in the 1990s, there had been decades after the end of the military dictatorship in Venezuela, there had been decades of what was known as the Pacto Punto Fijo, which refers to, there was an agreement made between the dominant bourgeois capitalist parties that they were basically just going to trade power every election or every two elections. And you had this switch between the Christian democratic forces and the so-called social democratic forces. They were just neoliberals, and they dominate and control Venezuelan politics for decades. And then you have something known as the Caracazo, which was, there was a massive economic crisis and there was a massive uprising. Some people call it a riot. It was an uprising against the neoliberal regime, against unaffordable food, against rising prices of public transportation. And there was this massive explosion, and the so-called democratic regime in Venezuela, a close ally of the United States, the neoliberal government responded by massacring protesters, killing as many as 3,000. We still don't know the official estimates. We probably never will. There's a good film produced by the Venezuelan government, by the Bolivarian government, about that. It's called just the Caracazo, and there's English subtitles you can find, I think. So after that, the uprising, you had this progressive nationalist in the military named Hugo Chavez Frias, who is just seeing the soldiers forced to open fire on their countrymen. This is a man from a poor working class barrio. He becomes radicalized and politicized, and he attempts a military coup, a revolution, and fails. But the military coup / revolution attempt was so popular that it turned Hugo Chavez into a famous public icon. And what happened is that he gave this famous speech after the failure of the coup, in which he said that we'll be back, we'll return, it's not over. And he's eventually released, and he runs for office in 1998, and he wins the election in a massive historic landslide, breaking the back of the two-party dictatorship, running as a progressive nationalist. And Hugo Chavez, he didn't even call himself a socialist. His party was called the Fifth Republic Movement, because they were creating a Fifth Republic, just as in with Andrés Manuel López Obrador right now in Mexico, AMLO. he has a process called the Fourth Transformation, which is a progressive nationalist kind of progressive transformation. Similarly, Hugo Chavez went through that process. But ironically, just as the U.S. attempt to overthrow the revolutionary Cuban nationalist government, the anti-imperialist government, it actually radicalized the Cuban Revolution and turned it Marxist by the Bay of Pigs invasion and the blockade. Similarly, it was the U.S. imperial intervention to try to overthrow the progressive revolutionary nationalist government in Venezuela that radicalized the Bolivarian Revolution and turned it into a socialist project. So we see this historical echo that as much as the U.S. tries to recolonize Latin America and control the region through these imperialist interventions, in many ways it actually helps further radicalize the revolutionary forces. We've seen that in the past several years with the Workers' Party in Brazil. When Lula came into power, I'll talk about that in a second, and I'll conclude as I go to your questions. When Lula came into power in Brazil, he was a progressive, a nationalist, but not a socialist. And it was actually the process of the soft coup against the Workers' Party, backed by the United States, led by the U.S. Justice Department, and the recolonization of Brazil, the installation of the Bolsonaro regime that radicalized the Workers' Party of Brazil and Lula and Dilma and turned them into revolutionary socialists. I mean, it's complicated for Dilma because she actually had been a revolutionary socialist. She was a guerrilla. But in the case of Lula, it made the Workers' Party even more revolutionary. So the point I'm saying is that when we look at U.S. imperialism in Latin America, it's a dialectical process, just as there are certainly many examples of U.S. imperialism successfully overthrowing progressive governments and installing right-wing dictatorships and regimes. There are many examples of that. You know, Guatemala in 1954, Chile in 1973, in Honduras in 2009. There are so many examples, but there are also examples of U.S. imperialism failing and further radicalizing the revolution. So what happens is that in 2006, Hugo Chavez gives a famous speech declaring socialism in the 21st century as his political mission. And that's the new phase that we're in right now for Latin America. So we saw, I mentioned in terms of U.S. imperialism, we have the phase of colonization of the Americas in the 1800s. And then we have the phase in the 1900s of this kind of colonization through military occupation and then creation of kind of colonial rump regimes that are representing U.S. interests. And then the U.S. military forces are forced out of Latin America. And then in the mid 1900s, you have the creation of these kind of proxy regimes that there's not a physical military occupation by the U.S., but you have a proxy regime. And then that finally leads to the process of toward the end of the 1900s and the success of these revolutions and the creation of bourgeois democracies and the neoliberal era. And then finally, the early 20th century and the creation of socialism in the 21st century. So finally, I'll just spend a few minutes here talking about that, and then we can have more of a discussion. So socialism in the 21st century, that's the movement that's really used more often in Latin America. Now, what it's known as in English, even though this phrase isn't really used in Spanish, is the pink tide. And what happens is, for the first time in its modern history, since European colonization of the Americas in the 1600s, we see that in Venezuela and in Bolivia and Ecuador and in Brazil and in Argentina, you have democratically elected left-wing governments come into power. And U.S. imperialism is in a crisis at this moment because, of course, you have 9/11 and you have the so-called war on terror, and the shift of the focus of U.S. imperialism kind of shifts to the Middle East once again. I mean, the U.S., of course, had been involved in supporting these kind of neo-colonial projects in the Middle East. That's absolutely true, with the Gulf regimes, with many military coups there, with the famous CIA coup in Iran in 1953. But with 9/11, with the war in Iraq, with the war in Afghanistan, which is technically South Asia, but the Middle East and South Asia, the U.S. kind of moves its imperial focus toward the Middle East. And of course, the U.S. is still supporting these reactionary right-wing forces across Latin America, but there's a little room to breathe for Latin America. And for the first time in its modern history, there are free and fair elections that are finally allowed. And surprise, surprise, when there are free and fair elections, they elect the left. They elect not necessarily socialist, but revolutionary, progressive nationalist forces that are anti-imperialist. And you have the rise of these movements. So you have Argentina and you have Kirchner there. And Kirchner was the kind of more to the right of people like Hugo Chavez, but he was a progressive and anti-imperialist. And then you have Rafael Correa in Ecuador. You have one of the most revolutionary of them all, Evo Morales in Bolivia. And then you have Pepe Mujica in Uruguay, one of the more social democratic leaders. You have Michelle Bachelet in Chile, who is definitely the most right wing of all of them, the worst of the progressive leaders in the pink tide. But in Chile, having a kind of center left leader is something very new in Chilean modern history. And what happens is that these governments not only take power, but they also unify. And that is what really scares the United States and the US imperial core more than anything else, is Latin American unity through regional institutions, not just politically. So you have the creation of things like CARICOM, which is this block of Latin American and Caribbean countries. You have UNASUR, which is a creation of a political bloc like United Nations for South America. And then even more important than that, you have the creation of Mercosur and the creation of the ALBA. The ALBA stands for the Bolivarian Alliance. This was it stands for the Bolivarian Alliance, free trade for the people of the Americas, or something to that effect. And the creation of a new economic bloc that would challenge US capital. Because the reality is that US capital kind of allowed some of these social democratic forces to come into power as long as they weren't challenging frontally US capital. But what happens is that you have these progressive governments that start at the beginning, they kind of allow US capital to operate, but then US capital it's similar to a process we see with Mexico now. At the beginning, US capital wasn't too scared of Andres Manuel López Obrador in Mexico because he's a progressive, he's not a socialist, he's anti-neoliberal, but he's not talking about expropriating the means of production and natural resources. But as the revolutionary movement becomes more revolutionary and moves further left, capital begins to fight the state. And there are coup attempts. And then what happens is there's a dialectical process of radicalization. And then there's expropriation. And then Hugo Chavez, after the 2002 coup backed by the United States in April, the United States, the Bush administration, overthrows Hugo Chavez, the elected president, and installs Pedro Carmona, who was an unknown right-wing neoliberal head of the Chamber of Commerce, who immediately moves to push neoliberal reforms. And the people of Venezuela, they loved Hugo Chavez so much that they just filled the streets and rose up against the coup regime. And then progressive elements of the military rebelled against the coup regime and then reinstalled Hugo Chavez. And then what happens is after that, Hugo Chavez becomes more radical. He becomes a socialist. He kicks out the U.S. oil corporations, which had previously still operated, and he nationalizes the oil in Venezuela and takes over the state oil company, PDVSA. And there's a process of them moving left, and they begin to fight with capital, and the United States begins to more aggressively push back against that. And then in response to that, they create an economic bloc. So again, I'm explaining this because it's a dialectical process where the more U.S. imperialism tries to recolonize the region, the more people resist. And I think the peak of that movement is really 2008, and it was really the Obama administration. And I really think that it was actually the Democrats and it was a few things. It was the Democrats and the drop in oil prices and the kind of return of right-wing forces that won democratic elections in Chile and some of like the more kind of center-left governments in the region in Argentina. And then of course you have a series of military coups and soft coups. So by 2008, you have the kind of the peak of the so-called pink tide of the socialism of the 21st century, where almost every government in Latin America has a progressive or even socialist government administration. And what happens is that the U.S. begins trying to recolonize the area again. So you have the military coup in Honduras in 2009. You have the soft coup in Paraguay in 2012 against Fernando Lugo, who that soft coup in Paraguay, a parliamentary coup, some people call it, that was a trial run for the coups used against the Workers' Party in Brazil in 2015, 2016. And then also there was something similar in Bolivia. So we saw this ebb and flow. So we saw the rise of these progressive, even socialist governments in the region. And then what happens is that most of these governments came in through bourgeois elections. They didn't control the military. The three governments that had, I mentioned those three phases, 59, 79, and 98, 99. 59, the Cuban Revolution. 79, the Sandinista Revolution. 98, 99, the Bolivarian Revolution. Those three governments were able to hold on because they were profound revolutions that they weren't just elections. In Cuba and Nicaragua, they weren't elections. They were revolutionary armed struggles. In Venezuela, it was a combination of a kind of attempted armed struggle coup, and then that came into fruition through an election. But there are these three revolutions. They were able to stay in power. And I'll conclude talking about why, because that brings us to today. Why were Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua able to stay when the progressive governments in Bolivia was overthrown? I'll get to Bolivia in a second. In Ecuador was overthrown. In Argentina, they never really had a super left wing, but they had a progressive. These governments, the reason they were not able to stay into power at least in that short-term period, was because they never controlled the state in the same way. They never were able to complete a revolution in the same way that Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela were able to, because they won bourgeois elections. So this brings us to, I mentioned the Obama administration. The Democrats, in the US, there's often, people talk about the lesser evil. The reality is that Democrats are often, I would argue, the more effective evil. And what we saw when Barack Obama came in is many people around the world, and especially in Latin America, thought he's going to be different. He's saying hope and change. He's the first Black president. His father was international, was African. So maybe he'll understand the struggle of people in the global South. Not at all. The reality is that Obama helped kind of remodel the American empire and try to remove the face of the Bush administration, which was just the blunt, veil taken off of U.S. kind of neocolonialism, of neoconservative foreign policy, of military force, the iron fist of U.S. war. And Obama comes in and says, we're going to talk about diplomacy through one side of the mouth, while through the other side, we back military coups and soft coups. And this brings us to the period of hybrid warfare and sanctions. So the Bush administration really helped start the use of sanctions as a form of economic war, but the Obama administration takes sanctions to a whole new level. The Obama administration begins an economic war on not only Iran with the sanctions, but also on Venezuela rather. In 2015, the Obama administration declares Venezuela to be a so-called national security threat to the United States. Insane. But that is what's used to justify U.S. sanctions. The Obama administration also, brilliantly, in a kind of insidious Machiavellian way, the Obama administration diversifies its energy domestic sources by moving toward fracking, which is very environmentally destructive, but it helps the United States rely less on oil by massively boosting domestic oil production. And then through negotiations with Saudi Arabia, really just orders to Saudi Arabia, tells Saudi Arabia, which is a kind of neo-colonial proxy, tells Saudi Arabia to massively overproduce oil by millions of barrels per day in order to flood the global market of oil, to drop the price of oil in the global market. Because one of the reasons these progressive governments in Latin America were able to govern so effectively is because there was a commodities boom in the 2000s. Oil prices were really high, which also led to because the petrodollar was high, it led to the rise in other commodities. And gas was high. So these countries in the region were riding the wave of using their natural resources for the first time in their modern history to benefit their own population. You have something known as resource nationalism. And in Venezuela with the oil, in Bolivia with the natural gas and the lithium, which came a little later, and in Ecuador with the natural resources, and in Brazil, which is a massive powerhouse for natural resources, the countries benefit for the first time from their gas and oil. And what the Obama administration does is not only overthrow these governments through coups, military coups, or soft parliamentary coups, but also tanks the price of oil and gas, but also insulates the U.S. economy from it by shale oil production, Arctic oil drilling, fracking. So it helps insulate the U.S. economy. It actually helps the U.S. economy because the price of gas is low for domestic consumption, while also intentionally tanking the oil-rich economies of Venezuela, Russia, Iran, and Brazil. And these countries are actually still really suffering from that policy of extremely low oil. And that's something that maybe we'll see change in the future. But a lot of these countries relied on high prices of oil to fund their social programs. That's one of the reasons for the economic crisis in Venezuela, along with the U.S. blockade and sanctions. So then finally, fast forwarding to the last few years of the Trump administration, I mentioned that the Obama administration helped. It was more effective. It was a more effective evil in that the Obama administration understood that the blunt military kind of force and neocolonialism of the Bush era, that isn't as strategic. Instead, the U.S. will support comprador right-wing forces and use economic sanctions and use proxy forces, parliamentary coups, anti-corruption efforts that are just lawfare, as we saw in Brazil. So claiming to support anti-corruption efforts that are actually just a form of legal warfare or lawfare to destabilize elected governments, which the Department of Justice did against the Workers' Party government in Brazil, and other forms of what we would call hybrid warfare, economic war, cyber war, information war, legal war. And that leads us to today with the Trump administration. And the Trump administration has in every way just continued the policies established by the Obama administration. It further exacerbated the crippling sanctions against Venezuela into a full-on blockade. And I spent about half the year in 2019 in Venezuela, so we can talk more about that in the Q&A. And then it also imposed more suffocating sanctions here in Nicaragua. And then the Trump administration backed a coup attempt here, a very violent coup attempt here in Nicaragua in 2018, which began in April and ended in July for about 3 months or so. And that hundreds of people were killed. Many of them Sandinistas. It was about half and half the casualties on each side, but there were these far-right forces that were trying to kill the police forces and the soldiers, these golpistas who were using mortar cannons and bombs, and they created these series of barricades, which were modeled after the coup attempts in Venezuela in 2014 and 2017. So after Hugo Chavez died in 2013, there was a move in the Obama administration, a move toward a new hybrid war with a coup attempt inside Venezuela through the support of what are called guarimbas. The guarimbas were barricades where these far-right golpista elements, golpista means coup monger in Spanish, but we don't really have that term in English, like a coup plotter. So in 2014, there are these very violent forces trying to destabilize the Venezuelan government, bombing government properties, erecting these violent barricades and fires and killing Chavistas, and then they fail. And then in 2017, there's another attempt with the guarimbas, and they once again fail, but we see elements of the military police, like this far-right fascistic leader, Oscar Perez, who steals a military helicopter and attacks the Venezuelan Supreme Court. Of course, it's not something you'll ever see mentioned in U.S. corporate media or British corporate media for that matter. And there were these very violent coup attempts. And that was when the Trump administration first came in 2017. Then in 2018, there's the violent coup attempt here in Nicaragua, which was kind of modeled after that. It also fails. And then in 2019, you have the briefly successful military coup in Bolivia. And the Bolivia coup kind of combines those two forms of coups I mentioned, of course, the classic military coup of the kind of Cold War era, but also with the kind of Obama era soft coup. So what we see is the Organization of American States, which I mentioned earlier, which has its roots in the Cold War in 1948, created as the coalition of anti-communist regimes backed by the United States. The Organization of American States, under the leadership of the new General Secretary, Luis Almagro, who is extremely right-wing, total golpista, extremely corrupt also. He with in hand in glove with the United States, he spreads this false narrative that the president of Bolivia, Evo Morales, supposedly rigged the election. He didn't win by the 10% threshold needed, and that what actually should have happened, according to that narrative, even though it was a lie, is that it should have gone to second rounds of the election. Of course, they didn't want a second round of the election, because the reality is that they didn't want an election. They wanted a military coup. And then the military forced Evo Morales to step down in what was supposedly called a voluntary decision. But if you're a president and the military tells you to step down, that's not very voluntary. It doesn't sound like a voluntary decision to me. And then there's the process of the revolutionary uprising against the coup regime, there was a series of strikes across the country that has brought the economy and the country to a halt. And then finally, this brings us to October with the overwhelming victory of the movement towards socialism party. So finally, here we are in 2020. And I think that we're in an interesting historical moment, because in terms of US imperialism, everything I spelled out there, all of the ebbs and flows, I actually think we're back at a moment that is kind of where the progressive left-wing forces in Latin America are on the rise once again. And it shows that as much as US imperialism tries to recolonize Latin America, it can't, because the reality is that it's no longer the 1800s. The people of Latin America are well organized. Revolutionary movements have significant power. In some countries, state power, deep into the state, not just through bourgeois elections, but in the case of Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela, they have institutional power through the state to further push the revolution and to help the vast majority of the people against the small 5% of the population that are the elite oligarch neo-colonial class. And right now we have revolutionary governments in Venezuela, Cuba, and Nicaragua. We have progressive governments in Mexico, Argentina. We have a revolutionary government in Bolivia, and it's very likely that in February we're going to have a left-wing government again in Ecuador. So we're reaching a new moment where we see that the U.S., especially in the Trump era, once again tried the kind of Bush era, very aggressive kind of neo-colonial enforcing U.S. policy in Latin America through suffocating sanctions, through coup attempts, through this neo-colonial rhetoric about the Monroe Doctrine. And that in some ways backfires and helps further strengthen the progressive forces in Latin America. So the last thing I'll say is that what concerns me now is that now that the Biden administration is coming in, a new Democratic administration, and they're going to continue the policies of the Barack Obama administration, I think we're going to see a return to the kind of liberal, benevolent face, the kind face of U.S. imperialism, where the same U.S. imperial policies of coups, of hybrid warfare, of economic warfare, those policies are going to continue, but we're going to see Washington try to use the language of diplomacy and of so-called authoritarianism in order to try to reimpose its will on Latin America. But the reality is that we're in a very different historic moment. And like I said, the progressive forces here in Latin America are more powerful than they've ever been. And that's something that cannot be put back in the bottle. The progressive forces in Latin America have really woken up. And I think that for South America and to a lesser extent Central America, the future looks pretty optimistic for the left and for progressive forces and for the majority of the working class. While at the same time, of course, in the imperial core, the far right is on the rise in all these countries. And you could say that perhaps there's a kind of political irony there, where while there is political conflict and crisis in the imperial core, that weakens the ability of the empire to wreak havoc abroad and actually open space for people in the global south to exercise their own democratic rights. So I'll conclude my rant there. I mean, that actually ended up going longer than I anticipated. Sorry, but I think that was like a really broad overview of the different phases of U.S. colonialism and neocolonialism and imperialism in Latin America, really from the founding of the United States to today.
Thank you, Ben. That was extremely comprehensive. More claps, but it's weird over Zoom. It's good to have that kind of historic, this materialist overview of history. I think that we get a lot of what we usually hear about these things are always alienated from what economic relationships were going on, and it's nice to get that kind of perspective that you've given us over the last hour. I guess we'll open it up to a Q&A. Although I will be self-indulgent and give myself the first question. Just touching off at the end of your speech, you mentioned the rise of the pink tide again. And I guess what I wanted to ask about is that countries like Mexico, you have Almo who's come in. What kind of moves can Mexico make to get away from the United States? Because it seems extremely limited. There's a lot of, while on the one hand, there's a lot more progressive economic policies from what I've noticed, the Mexico still has to cooperate with the United States in a number of ways, and the federales still operate to be the US's henchmen on the Guatemalan border, if I've got my geography right. So yeah, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, absolutely. And I have to say, man, I didn't realize I spoke that long. I'm sorry. I just got lost in all of that, but sorry for going way longer than I anticipated, but yeah, great question.
It was great. No.
Awesome. Well, great question. So Mexico's tricky because the reality is that I think what you just said is absolutely right, that for the Mexican left, their hands are very much tied, not only because of simply geopolitics, because the empire, and I'll say, brief aside, in Latin America, what's something very interesting is that when people talk about the U.S. empire, they just call it the empire, el imperio. They frequently say that. It's actually common. It's not just like revolutionary socialists. Like people will say, yeah, por el imperio, no podemos hacerlo por imperio. Like it's just common everyday speech. So in the case of Mexico, the empire is physically right there. They share a massive border. And not only that, there is the very close economic ties. The estimates vary, but people estimate that around 70% of Mexico's GDP is tied up with the U.S. economy. So there are very few things that Mexico can do. I think the best we can hope for Mexico is a social democratic government, which is kind of what they have now, for a variety of reasons. One, the U.S. is not going to tolerate a revolutionary government on its southern border, of course. I mean, look what they do way further south of its border. Look what they do in Southeast Asia and Vietnam and East Asia and Korea, in the Middle East, which would be West Asia, yet alone their southern border. So the reality of U.S. imperialism limits what Mexico can do. But then there's also, you mentioned, not just the issue of the economy and massive trade. And the reality is that if Mexico were to have sanctions on it, that would just totally, by the United States, that would cause a massive economic crisis. Because again, 70% of its GDP is tied up within the US, largely with exports to the US. And we saw actually López Obrador gave a speech several months ago in which he said, we're a sovereign country. And if Venezuela asked to buy oil from us, gasoline from us, we would sell gasoline to Venezuela, which was an incredible act, an FU to the US empire. And that same day, the U.S. actually imposed sanctions immediately in response. Less than 24 hours later, the U.S. imposed sanctions on a few Mexican companies, accusing them of doing business with Venezuela. And we saw that there was a very brief, it came back, but that the Mexican peso, just in the span of a few hours, drastically dropped. And that was just one little hint that the U.S. was, threatening Mexico, that if they try to go too far in the eyes of the U.S. empire, that the U.S. will grievously punish Mexico and the Mexican people through sanctions. And then there's finally the issue of the drug cartels. And the reality is that they have a lot of power in Mexico. The Mexican state is very weak. There are a lot of these countries in Latin America, the state is very weak. But in Mexico, it's such a huge country. It shares such a massive border with the United States. And the US has fostered the rise of these far right kind of death squad forces. We can't separate, I think, the wars in Central America in the 1980s from drug trafficking. We have to understand what the CIA strategy was. It goes back to the CIA war, the war in the Vietnam, and not just in Vietnam, but in the kind of heroin triangle. It's called that because of the United States, where the United States, the CIA used heroin money to fund its covert death squads and covert wars in Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. And then, of course, there was a flood of heroin in the region. So the CIA has its budget, what's on the books, right? But then it has a much larger black budget. We don't really know what it is for all these black ops. And the CIA uses drug money and arms trafficking and organized crime to support those projects. And that goes back to Vietnam, and it goes to the 1980s in Central America. So in Vietnam, there were all these U.S. soldiers who came home addicted to dope, to heroin, because there was such a flood of CIA heroin in the region. And similarly, in the 1980s, the CIA used cocaine trafficking to fund the death squads in Nicaragua and El Salvador. And what do they do with all that? You have a massive amount of cocaine because they're using all this cocaine to fund the Contras off the books. Of course, the Contras stand for the counter-revolutionaries in Nicaragua and El Salvador. So what the CIA does is they flood communities across the region with drugs, especially, by the way, Los Angeles, and black communities and poor communities in the United States, which leads to a massive epidemic of crack cocaine. And then what happens is that right-wing forces, including not just Republicans, but right-wing Democrats, like so-called tough on crime Democrats like Joe Biden, who made his name on the crime bill and crime legislation, they use the crack cocaine epidemic as a political reason to crack down and to become politicians. And so we see the kind of domestic repercussions of that process. And similarly in the region, we see also with Colombia, of course, with the paramilitary forces, which are used by the United States and Colombia to wage a protracted proxy war against the revolutionary guerrillas of the FARC, which is largely demilitarized now, and the ELN, the National Liberation Army. These progressive revolutionary socialist guerrillas, the drug cartels help to fund the paramilitary forces in Colombia to prevent the left from ever taking power in Colombia and maintaining the kind of narco right-wing dictatorship in Colombia. And there was a very similar process in Mexico, which is very much linked to that. Now, Mexico is a massive country. So as much as the United States tries to control it, it's such a big country that Mexico it has its own kind of domestic bourgeoisie. It has its own domestic power base, which is quite powerful. But the reality is that they only control certain parts of the country, and there are certain states in Mexico that are really controlled by the drug cartels. And when you look at, I can talk about this forever, but I'll just conclude by saying, look, we now know that the Zetas are one of the most feared drug cartels in Mexico. Absolutely just terrifying. The reality is that they're like the Al-Qaeda Contras in Syria, that they're the equivalent. And in what parts of the world are people regularly beheaded? In Syria, in the territory controlled by the so-called moderate rebels, so Idlib, Syria, controlled by Jabhat al-Nusra, Al-Qaeda, and ISIS, and in Raqqa, it was controlled by ISIS. And then where else in the world? In Colombia and Mexico, where leftists, where social movement activists, where campesino organizers, where labor organizers are beheaded by the narco death squads. They're basically, in their respective historical context, they're the same political phenomenon of the Contra death squads in the Middle East and the Contra death squads in South Asia and the Contra death squads in Latin America. And the reality is that through the process of this kind of U.S. neo-colonial war in Latin America, toward the end of the Cold War, Mexico had a progressive movement of the PRI, which, the PRI is complicated, but they became totally neoliberal in the 1980s. And then if you just look, Mexico had a more nationalist progressive tradition. Mexico had a stronger central state. But by the 1980s, 90s, and 2000s, and especially with Felipe Calderon, the right-wing president of the PAN, who they kind of ended the one-party dictatorship of the PRI, the institutional revolutionary party in Mexico, and the rise of the even more right-wing. The PRI became neoliberal, but then you had the even more right-wing forces that just embraced U.S. imperialism, the comprador class of the PAN and Felipe Calderon, and then the declaration of the war on drugs, which was another way for the U.S. to kind of help reassert more kind of neo-colonial control over the Mexican state. I think Mexico is in a process right now of trying to rebuild the kind of Cold War era progressive nationalist state that wasn't totally independent from the U.S., but also wasn't a total proxy of the U.S. like it was from the 80s until recently. And anyway, finally, I was going to say that, but we know that part of the destabilization of that nationalist process it's really a process of state formation, that Mexico was not allowed to go through the total process of state formation like other bourgeois democracies and other imperial countries, because it was always partially colonized, and Mexico is still partially colonized. The reality is that I mentioned the Zetas. The leaders of the Zetas were trained by the U.S. military. That's public knowledge. You can look it up. And also we know that the drug cartels that control El Salvador, they were all formed in the United States. And then the Bill Clinton administration deported them en masse from Los Angeles to El Salvador, where they kind of started taking over El Salvador. And so the reality is that many of these narco forces are actually products of U.S. imperialism. And that doesn't necessarily mean that they follow orders from the United States, but what it means is that they serve U.S. imperial interests by weakening states that could challenge the U.S. empire in the region.
Excellent. That was again very comprehensive. So I guess we'll take 3 or 4 questions, and I guess if it's agreeable to you, Ben, why don't we hear the questions first, and then since so much of this topic just all overlaps, I'd say you could probably address the 3 questions in one go, right? If that makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay. So who's asking?
Can I go first?
Yes.
So Ben, I was wondering, why does UN foreign policy favor, let's say, Europe, a white majority country, rather than, let's say, South America or Africa? The United States is willing to make peace, go out of its way to make peace in Europe, in Northern Ireland, in Estonia, Latvia, and all the former Yugoslavian countries. But it won't help the Hispanic community. It won't help the African American community. The African American community, I think, is 20 over 100,000. The homicide rate at the height of the Troubles was 20 over 100,000. So very similar homicide rate. But Northern Ireland is at peace now because of American foreign policy. But the American institution won't help its non-white citizens, but it's will very go out of its way to help white populations in Estonia and former Yugoslavia bring peace troops and make sure the region is peaceful. But won't do the same for Africa or South America. It'll cause conflict in those 2 regions. I was just wondering, is there a particular reason for that?
That's a really good question, and I'll keep it short. I mentioned earlier, there's a brilliant book by Noel Ignatieff called How the Irish Became White, about that process of the construction of whiteness as a political project. That it's not that culture, it's like the base and superstructure argument, right? Liberals often flip it and they think that the superstructure is the base and not vice versa. But the reality is that it's not because there's some culture. The cultural unity is a factor, but it's not because there's this white race that is all unified. The whole idea of whiteness is a political project. So there's an interesting example. If you just look at simply facial features or like the like how white someone's skin is, there are many parts of the world where people are lighter skinned but are not considered white. Parts of North Africa, parts of the Levant, of Palestine and Libya and Syria, people are much more light skinned. People even have sometimes very light eyes. In parts of the Southern Cone countries, like Argentina, because of Italian immigration, even in parts of East Asia, people are very light skinned, but they're not considered white because they have not been allowed to assimilate into whiteness as a political construct, because the reason that whiteness was created as a political construct was because of the European colonial project beginning in Western Europe and then colonizing North America and the creation of this kind of political bloc. And I would say NATO is a key element of that. So what's interesting is, where do Eastern Europeans fit into that? Because many Eastern Europeans would be considered, if you look at their skin color, they're white, but they're often racialized in a way that other people who could even be darker skinned, like maybe Italians who might have slightly darker skin, they're considered white in the United States and many parts of and in Europe, but some Eastern Europeans aren't. So it's not just about the color of your skin. Or Armenians, another example. It's not just so. I think what's interesting is just looking, when we're talking about whiteness, it's a reflection of the creation of this political bloc, of the idea of the West. And this is what I was talking about earlier. It's so crazy to me when I think about it. Why would the United States and Western Europe have some kind of inherent like brotherly alliance when they're separated by an entire massive ocean? Why? And this gets back to the Eurasian argument. Why wouldn't Western Europe and especially Central Europe, places like Germany, why wouldn't they have better relations and economic and political ties to Russia, to the other parts of Eastern Europe, even to China? The last time I looked at a map, China is closer to Germany than the United States is on the other side of the world. But it's because of the creation of this political bloc, the creation of the political bloc through European colonization, and then the creation of North America as an extension of that European colonial process, and then the creation of NATO and the European Union. Those political blocs unify. They're what keep the political construction of the West as a political entity together. The last thing I'll say about this is, even calling it the West doesn't make any sense. I'm in Nicaragua. Nicaragua is part of the West, technically, if you look at a map geographically, but it's not part of the West because the West doesn't refer to a geographic location, just as whiteness doesn't refer to a skin color. It's a political construct. The West refers to Western Europe and North America because it's a political project of imperialism.
Good stuff. Cool.
Josh, yeah. So during the Obama years, there was a massive expansion of U.S. military bases, especially in Africa, in Ireland unofficially because of the takeover of Shannon Airport. So just wondering what's the spread? What's the number or the concentration of U.S. the actual bases, as opposed to the covert bases across Latin America? My understanding is that the spread again during the Obama years. And just for Josh, I see there's at least one question in the chat zone there. You mightn't have seen, Josh, but just basically U.S. bases across South America and Latin America.
That's a really good question. When it comes to AFRICOM, I'm definitely not an expert, but I would recommend that there are some really good articles, especially this website called Tom Dispatch, which is one of the only websites left that still does investigative journalism. And they have some really good reports on AFRICOM because that's not really covered that much. And it's something new, but the U.S. military footprint all over the African continent is incredible. Almost every African country has U.S. military presence. As for Latin America, the U.S. military presence is pretty widespread, but it's often, like I said, it's done through kind of proxies, and it's not done as much through the U.S. boots on the ground, like in Korea or Germany or Japan. So a few things I'll say in response to that. One, we did a video report, my colleague Max Blumenthal and I, last year in Honduras. We actually visited, we weren't allowed in, of course, but we visited the outside of this military base in Central America, which is the largest U.S. military base in Latin America. It's called Palmarola, and it's it's also called Sotocano. It has two names, and it's in Honduras. And that's very important because that base was used in the 1980s as a base to arm and train the Contra death squads. Many of them were based in Honduras, and then they would cross over into Nicaragua to fight the government and to just blow up civilian infrastructure, blow up bridges and buildings, and mine the docks, and I mean just terror activity, and also El Salvador. And then also, of course, the U.S. has a significant military footprint in Colombia, and we've especially seen in the past few years a growth of U.S. military forces on the Colombian-Venezuela border. And they'll go to an area across from what's called Cucuta, which is the Venezuelan side of the border. And last year, in February 2019, there was a coup attempt. I didn't even talk about the Venezuelan coup attempt with Juan Guaido and all of that. So U.S. military forces have been physically present there on the Colombian side. They've been photographed and filmed. And then also, of course, I should talk about all of these military forces across Latin America are trained and armed by the United States, and many through what used to be known as the School of the Americas. The School of the Americas it's often known on the left as the School of the Assassins, because so many military dictatorships and military forces and torturers and assassins in Latin America were trained by the United States military, the Army, in Georgia, the state of Georgia, at what's called the School of the Americas. It recently rebranded. It has a really long name, which is the Western Hemisphere Institute, something to that effect, and it's pronounced WHINSEC, WHINSEC, and they're the same thing. But we actually published an article, The Gray Zone, looking at how in Bolivia, the majority of the military leaders behind the coup had been trained at WHINSEC, at the School of the Americas, and that's true for military dictatorships throughout Latin American history.
Thank you, Ben. Gavin, I see you.
Hiya, a fellow Yank here. So I really am a huge fan of the Gray Zone. I just wanted to say that I really appreciate all your guys' articles, especially on Syria and South America in general and Central America, because there's a lot of cowardice in the media, including the Irish media. The Irish media is absolutely terrible on reporting about these things. So it's good to see somebody telling it like it is. So I had one question. So I was really kind of surprised about Lenin Moreno when he came to power in Ecuador, and the process that took place afterwards. It seemed like it was almost an internal coup inside of PAI. And I was wondering if you could talk about, you said that it looks like it might be shifting to the left there. Could you give us a little bit of a perception of maybe what happened there, and then why you think it might be shifting to the left?
That's a great question. I'll say people in Ecuador, the folks I speak to there and across Latin America, they pretty openly say that they think that he is a U.S. intelligence asset. I'm talking about Lenin Moreno. So Moreno was the vice president under Rafael Correa, the progressive, socialist-oriented, social democratic leader in Ecuador. And as I mentioned, there's this process of radicalization. When Rafael Correa was in power, he was not very revolutionary. He was a social democrat, but again, these countries in Latin America and much of the global South, they're still partially colonized. So having an independent nationalist government go through that process of kind of stronger state formation and social democratic reform, that's actually something very revolutionary in the global South, because they were never able to develop in the same way imperialist countries were. So Correa, when he was in power, he helped fight poverty. He helped expand social programs, healthcare, education, very important things that these countries have all lacked. I should just briefly mention, someone asked about AMLO a few moments ago. I should mention that just in 2 years of being in power, AMLO, who's not even a socialist, he has more than doubled the minimum wage, which is also more than double the real minimum wage, because there has been negative inflation. The strength of the Mexican peso has increased. He's also expanded the number of people benefiting from social programs from 6 million to 25 million Mexicans. So similarly in Ecuador, there was this massive process of expanding the welfare state, helping people. And his vice president the entire time, well, not the entire time, I mean, he had multiple vice presidents, but during that process was Lenin Moreno. And a lot of people speculate that he was just kind of like a US asset who was sitting there in wait, just like Luis Almagro. Because Luis Almagro, the extremely right-wing general secretary of the OAS, who helped back the coup in Bolivia and is constantly trying to back coups in Nicaragua and Venezuela. In fact, he called for a US military invasion of Venezuela. This is the head of the OAS. I mean, absolutely comical, farcical. He's also called for military intervention and coups in Nicaragua and Cuba. Well, Luis Almagro, what's his history? He was actually the foreign minister under the progressive government of Pepe Mujica in Uruguay. So similarly, people speculate that both of those people had been US intelligence assets, or simply they're just extremely corrupt and were just bought off by the US empire. And look, the reality is part of the element of empire, of imperialism, is that the US is just the richest country in the world, although China is going to surpass soon. But the US is the richest country, and they can just bribe the Latin American bourgeoisie because Latin America is one of the poorest regions of the world. And look, the reality is that in many of these countries, the minimum wage is between 200 and 300 US dollars per month. So it's been confirmed that in the Bolivia coup, for instance, the United States just paid off a lot of elements of the military who were not, because like I said, in Nicaragua, Cuba, and Venezuela, they had a revolutionary process that was able to change the character of the state institutions, specifically the military and the police. In Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua, they created a new military force and a new police force that was progressive and revolutionary oriented. And they did not do that in Bolivia, because in Bolivia, one of the weaknesses of the revolutionary movement, which is extremely powerful there at the grassroots level, but at the institutional level, it's very weak. The majority of the Bolivian population is indigenous, 60 to 70%, and the working class is extremely well organized. I mean, I saw with my own eyes, it's incredible how well the unions are organized with the union federations, the 6 federations, and they have massive general strikes. But the reality is that because the indigenous community was left with the history of extreme racism in Bolivia, and the people of European colonial descent, the elites who dominated the country for years until Evo Morales, the indigenous majority was never really allowed to have control in the state institutions. It wasn't until Evo Morales that he actually created mandatory military service to allow indigenous people to try to have more influence in the military and the police. But the reality is that we know that the US paid off individual cops with $50,000 and paid off the top echelon, the generals of the military, with around $1 million. And that came from the US, but it also came from local Bolivian oligarchs, specifically Luis Fernando Camacho and Branko Marinkovic and their families, who are extremely rich oligarchs. And look, the reality is that in the United States or in Western Europe, if someone offered you 50,000 pounds or $50,000 to back a military coup, people might do it. I mean, there's a lot of poverty, but that's not that much money, frankly. But in Latin America, that's a lot of money, $50,000, and $1 million is a huge amount of money. So the fact of the matter is, sure, it's possible that Lenin Moreno and Luis Almagro could have been U.S. assets. At the very least, they're willing to collaborate openly with U.S. imperialism. But there could be a simpler answer, and that's that people in Latin America, the majority of people are very poor. And if you don't have that revolutionary ideology, not just a socialist ideology, like I said, but even more importantly, a nationalist ideology against U.S. imperialism, it's very easy to bribe people, even so-called progressives.
Thank you, Ben. Now we have some questions in the chat that I'll read out and hopefully we can get through. So, question for Ben. You briefly mentioned the role of Russia and China have played in South America. Could you expand on what role both countries are playing at the moment and how that interacts with the Cold War against China, if it does? Thank you.
This is a great question. I'll keep it short, even though I know I keep saying that, but I could talk about this for the entire time too, but this is extremely important. Russia has very good relations with a lot of left-wing countries in Latin America because of historical reasons. And this is something that I think about a lot, actually. What's fascinating is that even though the Russian government today is certainly not a left-wing government, at the same time, I also wouldn't say that it's, I think the degree to which it's right-wing is also exaggerated, at least in economic policy and foreign policy. Now, in terms of cultural politics, it's complicated, and certainly there are reactionary elements of the Russian ruling class today and the Russian ruling party and the movement. But the reality is that for a variety of historical reasons, the Russian policy in Latin America stayed pretty similar after the overthrow of the Soviet Union. And I think that, and it's something I think about because it helps understand, one, why Russia and China have pretty good relations today, why the attempt to try by the United States, by US imperialists, the kind of Kissingerian strategy to try to bring capitalist Russia over to unify with Western Europe and the United States against China failed. And I think that it's because when you look after the end of the first Cold War, the United States imposed this kind of neo-colonial puppet regime with Yeltsin, a total drunk, alcoholic neoliberal, which privatized the Russian economy, leading to the capitalist oligarchs who still control the economy largely today. And then they tried to forcibly integrate Russia into the kind of Western axis. But the reality is that Russia is a significant power and has its own geopolitical interests. And the only way they could do that is if Russia were to permanently subordinate. Well, there are two ways: break up Russia, which is what the United States tried to do with Chechnya, and what it did with all the color revolutions with these countries, like on the borders of Russia, with Ukraine, with Georgia, and even with Armenia to an extent, although they failed with Azerbaijan, what they're trying to do now. So trying to break up the kind of the former Soviet republics and then eventually break up the Russian Federation itself, that failed. And the only other strategy would be to permanently, forcibly subordinate Russia to NATO and the EU. That's not, Russia is a separate geopolitical bloc. And the reality is that the nationalists in Russia who took power, they're certainly not socialists. I mean, they're capitalists, but they're nationalists. And they want Russia to be powerful in its own interests. And they've not because of they're committed to a socialist project, but simply because they recognize that Russia is still kind of actually partially colonized, that it's in their own national self-interest to unify with China and also to unify with the progressive governments in Latin America and to unify with Iran. So because Russia's kind of partially colonized, Russia has been a friend to a very good friend, actually, to the progressive anti-imperialist forces in Latin America. And that's why I'm saying that it's not motivated by the same Soviet ideology, which was a socialist anti-imperialist ideology. Instead, it's Russia's national self-interest. But the reality is that Russia has really helped Venezuela a lot, especially in terms of military force, which has been a deterrent to prevent the US from invading. Also, economically, Russia has helped, and Russia has helped Nicaragua. In fact, here in Nicaragua, Russia is extremely popular. You see Russia donated a lot of buses. So there's a lot of buses that have the Russian flag on them here. And Russia was kind of forced, because of US imperial policy, to maintain the kind of same foreign policy in Latin America that it had during the Soviet era. So if you look at the countries where Russia has good relations, they tend to be the more left-wing progressive governments. Now, China is more complicated. China, because of course, what happened after the Sino-Soviet split is that China took this kind of ultra-left position of social imperialism being more dangerous than capitalist imperialism, and China actually unified with US imperialism for a period there. And then what happened is, after the overthrow of the Eastern Bloc and the Tiananmen events, after the overthrow of the Socialist Bloc in the Eastern Bloc, the US tried to overthrow the Communist Party of China and Western European elements, and they failed. And that leads to the kind of so-called pro-democracy movement and the Tiananmen events, and see what we see in Hong Kong now. And then the Chinese Communist Party recognized that they had reconciled too much with Western capital and Western imperialism. And in order to maintain their territorial integrity as a consistent bloc as China, but also in their own self-interest as a separate, independent, anti-imperialist bloc, China would actually have to start challenging Western prerogatives. So what we saw with the rise of Xi Jinping is that China took a much more activist foreign policy. It did not allow itself to be subordinated in the same way that it had been before. And China is now increasingly a strong voice in support of anti-imperialism and national liberation struggles, which honestly actually is kind of new, because China had always taken a position of non-intervention in foreign affairs, especially after the overthrow of the Eastern Bloc. If you look at China's UN votes, it had always been a friend of the global South, but it didn't take an activist foreign policy role like Russia did. Russia often vetoes US and Western European kind of imperial policies at the UN. Russia is, like I said, it's often been a friend, and it's in its foreign policy. Its domestic policy is different. Its foreign policy has been very activist in support of the global South. And that's something increasing for China. So in Venezuela, China has been extremely important in helping China weather the storm. China is bravely resisting US sanctions and buying oil from Venezuela. So there's been a lot of secondary sanctions against the United States because the US empire, it sees itself as the emperor of the planet and says that no country not only can it unilaterally impose sanctions on a country like Venezuela, but it can impose secondary sanctions on any country that does business with Venezuela. So it's imposing all these sanctions on China, but China is continuing to do business with Venezuela. In fact, Venezuela is now listing its oil in the Chinese yuan. So China and Russia are working together with the Shanghai Cooperation Organization to try to break the monopoly of the US dollar as the de facto global currency reserve, and specifically the US petrodollar. So I would say that China's role is kind of new in the past 10 years, that China has become more activist in its foreign policy in supporting progressive forces in Latin America. But the reality is that, yes, finally, that the US is really increasingly using that as a kind of excuse to justify more aggressive intervention. I've written some articles looking at what U.S. Strategic Command and U.S. Southern Command, the elements of the U.S. military, they're expanding their military presence in Latin America. And if you listen to their rhetoric, they say China and Russia are in our hemisphere. So they always say our hemisphere. Again, we see the invocation of the Monroe Doctrine, the idea that the Western Hemisphere belongs to Uncle Sam. And the reality is that, like I said, in military ways, Russia has helped, but China's involvement in Latin America is mostly infrastructure development, like in other parts of Asia and in Africa. And the reality is that over hundreds of years of US and Western European colonialism and imperial conquest, they have not developed these countries in the South because they actually haven't, they don't want to develop them. They want to underdevelop them or even de-develop them because they want to keep these countries in the global South subservient to their own colonial interests and neocolonial and imperial interests, because that's how they can maximize the extraction of capital and the exploitation of labor in these regions. China's relationship is fundamentally different. China is actually helping to develop infrastructure and to develop these countries in a way that the United States has never done. And so that's the so-called threat to US imperialism. And that's why the US is increasingly trying to prevent countries in Latin America from having relations with China and Russia.
Excellent. Now we've got one more question in the chat. So, considering how the US has managed to weaponize oil and commodity prices to cripple social democratic/socialist governments, would a transition from fossil fuels to renewable energy, in addition to combating environmental degradation, also help undermine Washington's economic influence in Latin America/peripheral countries?
This is a really good question. And I think this is a really kind of central contradiction to think about in going forward for the entire world with the climate catastrophe we're living through and climate change. I'll say this is definitely not my expertise. I have some thoughts on it, but I'll recommend a friend and comrade of mine who's brilliant on this topic named Max Ajl. That's spelled Max A-J-L. He's a brilliant scholar, and he is an anti-imperialist, and he is really dedicated himself to thinking about how we can integrate the environmental movement with anti-imperialism. Because the reality is, going forward, green imperialism is increasingly going to become a tool of US imperialism and EU imperialism, Western European imperialism. Going forward, just as pink washing became a tool and human rights discourse and so-called democracy, we have to support democracy and gay rights and women's rights. And in order to do that, we have to kill queer people and kill women by bombing the global South and imposing sanctions. Similarly, we're going to see the United States and the EU say, we have to back this coup like Juan Guaido and whatever, because Venezuela is a petrostate that produces too much oil and it's bad for the environment. And we need to move toward renewable energy. That's become weaponized as rhetoric. I have a few thoughts on this. One, in these countries in Latin America, these progressive and socialist governments understand that climate change is an existential threat to them. They're not insane climate denialists like many people in the US government are, or even worse, like the Democrats who understand what's happening but do nothing to change it, to do actually no policies to stop climate change because they're neoliberals and totally subservient to the capitalist class, like Obama. So in Latin America, we see that these progressive and socialist forces in the pink tide have very much embraced forms of decarbonization, forms of greening the economy, greening the country, investing in renewable energy, of trying to fight climate change. In fact, here in Nicaragua, which is a very small and a very poor country, it's actually it has one of the smallest carbon footprints in the entire world. And it's one of the most green friendly countries in the world. In Venezuela, the reality is more complex. And in Cuba is one of the most environmentally friendly countries in the world. It has a very low carbon footprint, and it strongly supports these policies around the world. In Venezuela, it's complicated, and that's a product of Venezuela's unique history as a country, predating the Bolivarian Revolution. For 100 years, ever since oil was discovered in Venezuela, it has been a petrostate. And that's a problem, and it's a good thing and it's a bad thing. It's something that led to the economic crisis. Like I said, the economic crisis was largely also caused by the US blockade and sanctions. But also the fact is that Venezuela has relied on oil prices for 100 years as it's the bulk of its economy, the vast majority of its GDP and its exports. So what happens is that was a blessing and also a curse, in the sense that Hugo Chavez could come in and fund this revolutionary transformation and fund these social programs and create 3 million new housing units and free education and all of these other incredible victories of the revolution by using oil money. It was easy. The colonial elites, the comprador class, had used all the oil money to the extent that it wasn't privatized and controlled by North American and European oil corporations. The capitalist elite, the comprador oligarchs, they were enriched by that money. And then Hugo Chavez came in as a resource nationalist and said, we're going to use the oil to benefit our country. That's similar with Evo Morales in Bolivia. The country has very big gas reserves and also lithium. And lithium is going to be extremely important going forward, not only because it's going to be important for our phones and our TVs and anything with a renewable battery, so rechargeable batteries, so our cameras and our laptops and lights, but also going forward if we're going to have like a green revolution with technology and move toward green renewable energy, we need a lot of lithium, and that's going to come from Bolivia. So the reality is that I think that it's just a fact of the matter. There has to be a mix for these countries in the global South of extractivism and environmental policy, because Venezuela and Bolivia and Brazil and even Mexico, which has massive oil production and a large state-owned oil company, Pemex, these countries were never allowed to develop in the same way that imperialist countries were allowed to develop, which was largely through theft, as we were talking about, but also through fossil fuel exploitation and extractivism and mining. So the fact is that these liberals who are now telling condescendingly in the global north, telling the global south, they can't extract their own natural resources to create revenue to develop their country. That is another form of kind of neocolonialism and imperialism. It's also just extremely patronizing. So we see Naomi Klein saying she opposes the Venezuelan Bolivarian Revolution because it's petro-populism. Give me a break. I mean, it's so condescending. And finally, the last thing I'll say is, look, you have to have revenue to have a revolution. There's a lot of people who don't, especially anarchists and ultra leftists, who don't understand why all these countries don't just why don't they just magically nationalize everything as if they have the human capital to do that, as if they have the engineers to do that, as if you could, it's just that easy saying overnight, we just nationalize the entire economy and it's going to run exactly the same as it did. Not thinking about capital flight, of human brain drain, which has been very big, of all the engineers leaving the country. And the fact of the matter is that they often don't have the technical expertise to be able to develop the lithium industry and the gas industry and the oil industry and all of these things. Actually, Russia and China have been helping in that department. But the reality is that these countries in the global south are going to have to continue using extractivism and mining. That's to say it. They're going to have to keep mining while the global economy, not just their local economies, but the global economy, with the burden being on the global north and the already developed imperial countries, there has to be a proportional move toward a green economy. And that burden cannot be on South America and Africa and Asia, because look, especially in Latin America, these countries are extremely poor and they don't have a big revenue base. And if you want to spend, like I said, you have to have money to have these social programs. If you're going to have free public education, free socialized medicine, free maternity leave, all these things, they have to be paid for. And in order to be paid for, you have to have revenue. And the United States can print dollars. Latin America can't. Latin America has to have revenue, and it has to be through natural resources until they develop their economy. Because in many of these countries, in Mexico, in Central America, and to a lesser extent, parts of South America, the majority of the country still lives in the informal sector. They don't have paychecks. So in order to make money, they have to work in the streets and they have to sell their labor, like old school style working class. They're not part of like the industrialized bourgeoisie in the same way that has a paycheck. And among those that do, the government can't extract that much revenue because people are so poor. So in places like Bolivia and Venezuela, resource extraction is by far the largest source of revenue funding the revolution. That's a reality. So again, there has to be, I totally support a movement toward renewable energy. It needs to be done because of climate change, but it has to be done where the burden is placed on the industrialized imperial core, and the global south has to have a mix of extractivism to develop its country with a move toward renewable energy.
Well, Ben, that was a fantastic talk this evening. I think obviously these conversations over Zoom are quite awkward, and you don't really get a perception of how much, of what the audience thinks. But I think everyone was very well engaged. I'll speak on behalf of everyone and say that it was splendid, and that Naomi Klein quip had me in stitches for about 2 minutes. So, it worked.
Oh man, and I was trying to be polite tonight. There were so many other people I could have name dropped, but I'll leave it at that.
Wonderful. But yeah, I'm glad that we had you on, and I hope to have you on again. I mean, I because obviously you're happy to talk, and we're more than happy to listen. So yeah, at that, thank you very much, and have a good evening, everyone, and you too, most of all, Ben.
No, thank you all so much. I'm sorry for going pretty long, but as you can tell, I'm a little passionate about all this stuff, and I think that even for our comrades across the ocean over there in Western Europe, Latin America is extremely important, not just because of the role of Western European governments in supporting these imperial policies, but also for the left. I mean, around the world, Latin America is really, I think, a beacon of hope for the left, and there's so many lessons we can learn from for how the left can take power and can govern.
Absolutely. All right. Well, thanks everyone, and hope you all have a good night.